are certainly a bit more familiar with the first part of chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, those words that we read at the beginning of the service in the call to worship. This next portion that we just read is not as popular or maybe familiar. In fact, as I was preparing for today, I always like to look at many different commentaries to see what others think about this passage, those that are smarter than me, what they have gleaned. And I'll tell you, there aren't very many commentaries on this particular passage. In fact, what I also learned is that Ecclesiastes is a book that has some debate as to whether or not it should even be in our canon. You see, the whole book seems to talk a little bit more about ideas than it does of God. We like to attribute Ecclesiastes to the great King Solomon, who received wisdom from God. But it comes a little later after King Solomon died, but it is in that tradition of imparting wisdom. In chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, the author names himself or herself with this word, coelette. Coelette means one who assembles. Now, we're not talking about someone who puts together IKEA furniture. It's not that kind of assembling. The assembling of people, a gatherer of folks around him or her. It means teacher or preacher. But this is no ordinary teacher, as we hear the words that is shared in this book. It seems that this teacher has a lot of questions, has a lot to kind of dismantle and think about. This author takes what is conventional wisdom of the time and kind of asks questions and doubts it and tears it apart, kind of. He's a bit of a contrarian, is how we will describe him. Right? In this particular passage, what we find is that very first question. He says, what is it that we are doing here? What is all the good of our hard work if we only get a few possessions? When he's listing the times and the seasons in the first part of chapter 3, he's really just naming this rhythm of life. At that time, the conventional wisdom would have been that God, sends down the rain, that God decides this, that God is in control of everything. But what does that mean, this teacher will ask? What is it that we have control over? What do we have to do with anything as humans if God has it all covered? The teacher continues throughout the book to ask such questions, to challenge the wisdom of the day. And so what we hear is not so much answers, but just some ideas in which we, as those who have assembled here this day, as those have throughout generations, that we consider who we are. What is our role in the world? What is it that we labor for? Now, I wondered if there are other contrarians in our biblical history, in our texts. And I think we could say that Jesus was a contrarian, right? That Jesus took the conventional wisdom of the day and flipped it upside down. For instance, we know that Jesus sat at the table with tax collectors and sinners. The conventional wisdom of the day was that the righteous should not sit with sinners, that the righteous would not become dirtied by those sinners, that until the sinners became righteous, we could not dine with them, and Jesus sat with them. Jesus included women in his inner circle, not something that conventional wisdom would leave room for. And then Jesus, in the ultimate challenge of conventional wisdom in his death and resurrection, showed us a new way. We might be reminded that the conventional wisdom of Jesus' time was that the world was flat. And there was a dome that shaped over the flat earth. And God resided above the dome where the heavens and the rain and the waters were. And the idea was that when you die and you're buried underneath the earth, you're farther away from God. That there is a separation, like permanent separation from God. Jesus dying on the cross and then resurrecting completely changed the way people thought about their relationship with God. There would be no permanent separation. Death would not have the final answer. There would be connection to God in everlasting life, eternity. See, we heard that in the book of Ecclesiastes, didn't we? That God has placed within us a sense of eternity, that we would be connected to the divine. I believe Paul, the Apostle Paul, was also a contrarian. He had a lot of ideas that went against conventional wisdom, like the fact that slave and free were equal, that male and female had the same access to faith and spirituality and church. So then I began to think about who are the contrarians of our time. Who are those that push the envelope, who take what society says is the way it should be and flip that, right? So I think Galileo is probably a pretty good one. Maybe not like modern times, but yeah, he made some pretty big changes. Winston Churchill. I even think possibly LeBron James, right? Conventional wisdom says that you get to a certain age, you can no longer play a sport, but LeBron James is pushing the envelope on that. But then I learned about another person, Sir John Templeton. Anybody heard of that name? Oh, well done. I had never heard of him before. John Templeton was born in 1912 in a small town in Tennessee. And he became kind of a financier. He went to Yale, graduated during the Great Depression, and he was a contrarian in terms of how he invested his time and his money. On Wall Street, John would look for those companies, countries, people who everyone else said would never be successful. And he placed all of his investment and all of his energy there, because he was an eternal optimist. He said that anyone can make progress, can become successful. He did kind of conform to the idea of buy low and sell high, but he would go lower than anyone else would, and he would be patient, investing and waiting until those who were said to never be successful got to the top of their game or their industry, and then he'd cash in. So he made a lot of money. But for John, that was just a part of his life. In the second half of his life, he took those, all that he gained, all of the money he made, and he created a foundation. And in that foundation, he was determined to find new spiritual information. He wanted to invest in those people who would ask questions about humanity and the divinity of God. He wanted to find those who would be willing to look at science, who were willing to ask questions of other areas of life outside of religion, but also within religion, and answer that question about who we are in this physical world and what does it mean to be human. His greatest hope was to encourage all of humanity to be more open-minded about the possible character of ultimate reality and the divine. Through his foundation, he created a prize, and every year someone would be awarded a great amount of money, much larger money than the Nobel Peace Prize, to someone who could ask the questions and find some answers. Now, Sir John had some theological views that were very different than conventional wisdom of the time as well. He thought there was something to learn from all religions. And he once said to an interviewer, "I grew up as a Presbyterian. Presbyterians thought the Methodists were wrong. Catholics thought all Protestants were wrong. The Jews thought the Christians were wrong. So what I'm financing is humility. I want people to realize that you shouldn't think you know it all." When Sir John passed away in 2008, The Economist magazine said this: Sir John revered thrift and had a horror for debt. His parents had taught him that in the small town of Tennessee, instilling it so well in him that his white columned house in the Bahamas, overlooking the golf course, he would still cut up computer paper to make notebooks. But he made an exception for love, which needed spending. You could give away too much land and too much money, said Sir John, but never enough love. And the real return for giving away love was immediate. It would produce more love. What Sir John seemed to come to a conclusion about is similar to what Colette, the teacher of Ecclesiastes, said, is there's something about our relationship with God, there's something about what we do that is so important that we must grasp a hold of it and share it. To love what we do, whatever it is that God has given us to do. To love it with so much of our energy that it flows over to other people. That no matter what the world says we should feel or understand, we might just choose love. As we move into this election season and as we move into our new worship series, I believe that we should be challenged to be contrarian to the common idea in our world that if we cannot think alike, we cannot live with each other or we cannot be in relationship with each other. To be contrarian, that when the world wants to be divided, that we call for unity and live into that. But if we walk away with nothing else today, would you join me in the words of the teacher who says, eat, drink, and be happy? Like, what if that's what we did? Be grateful for the things that God has given us, to see the beauty in each one of us, and to choose to be merry, to choose to be happy. I think we would change the world as well. Thanks be to God. Amen.